Kenya has now overtaken Nigeria as the largest importer of second-hand clothing. And the second-hand clothing that we
East Africa is listening to Muzalendo podcast. Mi naitwa Jumoja, Muzalendo wa Afrika Mashariki. Today, I want to talk about Kenya. Kenyans always claim to be the biggest and the best developed country in East Africa. But I ask them, what development? Kenyans always talk in terms of buildings. Buildings are not development, Kenyans. Let me explain to you why. You can't be the most developed country in the region, in East Africa, but when you're the biggest importer of second-hand clothes, in Africa. Kenya imports more second-hand clothes than Nigeria, yet Nigeria has a population 5 times bigger than that of Kenya. So there's no way Kenya can say they are more developed when they're the biggest importer of second-hand clothes. Do you know that 95% of Kenyans, that's close to 100%, are putting on second-hand clothes? Do you know that? Can you believe that? 95% of Kenyans don't know what a new cloth looks like or a new shoe. You understand? Kenyans say they are developed because Kenya, they compare themselves to politicians. A politician riding an helicopter, Kenyans think they're developed. No. Development is like, look at Tanzania. Is when the lowest person is respected and the lowest person is provided with better public transportation. Now let's forget that. Kenya is the biggest importer of second-hand clothes, but you know also Kenya has the biggest slums in East Africa and Africa. You can't be the biggest, the best, you can't be the most developed country, but when you have the biggest slums in the entire African continent. You understand? You have the biggest slums in East Africa. So Kenya is not more developed country in East Africa. No, that's debunked. You can't be the most developed country when, listen, you're the biggest importer of second-hand clothes, you're the biggest importer of second-hand items in the East African region. Look at Tanzania, for example, or Rwanda. In Rwanda, less than 50% of people put on second-hand clothes. You understand? In Tanzania, look at Tanzania. Only 70% and less put on second-hand clothes. In Kenya, it's a whopping 95% of people putting on second-hand clothes because they can't afford new clothes. That's the mentality of Kenyans. So you can't tell me you're the most developed when you don't even have self-dignity to say we're gonna put on new clothes. You understand, Kenyans? You're not the most developed country. So mimi nataka mnyamaze about development because Kenya is not the most developed country. You can't say that you're the most developed country in East Africa when you send the most maids in the Middle East. Compare, like for example, to Rwanda and Tanzania. You could not know that's not development. That is slave law paying jobs in the Middle Eastern countries that everywhere you Kenyans are being sent. So Kenyans, listen. I have no problem with Kenya, but Kenya needs to stop saying they're the most developed country in East Africa. Mambo mingi, too much words don't define, doesn't define development. Development is defined by how people in the country. You can't tell me the most developed when the biggest import of second-hand clothes more than Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi combined. Kenya imports second-hand clothes more than Uganda and Ethiopia combined. Think about that. That's not development. That's a shame to East Africa dignity. And I think Kenyan activists that went to Tanzania and needed more in Kenya to talk about the importation of second-hand clothes in their country. What's your take on this? I'll appreciate if you leave a comment. Mimi nataka wajamaa wote mwashe comment, mugonge like na subscribe. Let's expose Kenya for what it is. It's not a developed country. It's a country that's like a dump to colonial powers. Asante na kwaheri.